Sex-positive feminism, despite the name, is a disaster for women. Sex positivity benefits men. Sex positivity claims to be about removing shame from women's sexuality. Female expressions of sexuality have historically been stigmatized, and women have been judged for enjoying sex or being promiscuous. Removing shame, doesn't that sound nice on the surface? Of course it does. The problem is that it is only on the surface. Deep down, we are entrenched in a society that is oriented almost exclusively towards male pleasure and revolves around the objectification, exploitation, and coercion of women. Without a broader cultural shift, the promise of guilt-free, shame-free, safe, and enjoyable sex for women is empty. An excruciatingly brief history of feminism. In 1792, Mary Wollstonecraft stood up and said, "Hey, girls and women should get educations too." Women got educated, expressed their opinions, fought for their rights, and in 1920, the first wave of feminism crashed down on the shores of suffrage, and women won the right to vote. For the next few decades, feminism experienced a lull. Then, in the 1960s, with women's roles changing rapidly, second-wave feminism emerged. In the 1960s and 70s, a huge shift occurred with the widespread availability of the birth control pill and with the Supreme Court decision in Roe v. Wade, which legalized abortion in the U.S. As a result, women had a newfound control over their reproductive capacity. Add to that new freedom the free-loving vibe of the hippies and a cultural rebellion against the 1950s housewife archetype, and the idea of sexual liberation was born. And at the time, women's liberation was equated with sexual liberation. In fact, those terms were often used interchangeably. But soon after these ideas emerged, second-wave feminists split on three key topics: pornography, prostitution, and bondage and sadomasochism. On one side were feminists like Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon, who were critical of these things, saying they degrade women. On the other side were so-called sex-positive feminists like Ellen Willis, who thought opposing pornography was puritanical, authoritarian, and anti-free speech, and believed that a culture that supports pornography and prostitution is a culture in which women can freely enjoy sex with no stigma. Which could be considered a very privileged view, as it prioritizes the theoretical pleasure of a few women over the degradation of women as a class. But it's not really surprising if you look at who controls our society, men, that this became the dominant mainstream form of feminism as we moved from the second wave into the third wave in the 1980s and 90s. And that is where we remain. Over the past 30 to 40 years, we have become a culture that supports pornography of ever-increasing vileness, and where women are objectified in advertising, television, movies, music, sports, and on social media. Dating apps, often used for casual hookups, are some of the most used apps. For example, Tinder has about 8 million users in the US and was valued at $42 billion in 2021. And young women self-sexualize as we teach them that their ability to seduce men is a route to empowerment. It's not. While women are busy making themselves more attractive, men are cementing themselves in positions of real power. This culture, we are told, creates a sex-positive environment that will lead to a sense of freedom, happiness, and actualization in women. This is a lie. Our sex-positive society is really a hypersexualized society, where imagery in both pornography and mainstream media penetrate women's consciousness to drive anxiety and low self-esteem. Anxiety and low self-esteem are not generally associated with liberation and empowerment. You have to wonder, is it merely a coincidence that eating disorders like anorexia nervosa, based on an obsession with body shape and appearance, began to be prevalent in young women in the mid-1960s, their rise perfectly correlated with the introduction of the sexual liberation movement? Eating disorders were rarely seen before this time, but became so prevalent amongst young women that they earned their place in the DSM-3 in 1980. Perhaps it's also a coincidence that 92% of plastic surgery procedures are performed on women and just 8% on men. Or a coincidence that in the internet age, when 10 to 15% of web traffic goes to pornography sites with their displays of impossible female body standards, that the fastest growing cosmetic surgery is labiaplasty. Labiaplasty is a procedure where parts of the vulva are cut away to improve appearance. This mutilating surgery has no medical indication and can have significant side effects like scarring, numbness, and pain. And perhaps it's also a coincidence that in this environment, 84% of American women remove some or all of their pubic hair. And when asked why they do this, many women respond, to avoid humiliation and judgment from men. Rather than being freed from shame, women are hyper aware that their bodies don't belong to them, but are instead objects for men's consumption. Instead of feeling empowered in their bodies as they exist, women look for ways to change themselves into what they believe men want. What about hookup culture and the prevalence of casual encounters, often facilitated by dating apps like Tinder? Sex positivity goes beyond reducing shame to actively encouraging promiscuity as the norm. It promotes sex as a means of female expression and empowerment. But the reality is that the easy availability of sex is creating a generation of people, men and women, who are numb, alienated, and disconnected, seeing sex with a stranger as just another activity, like going for coffee or playing mini golf. On a biological level, this doesn't really work for women. In a woman, sex leads to the release of oxytocin in the brain. Oxytocin is a bonding hormone which creates strong emotional attachment to a partner. Yes, even to a stranger who a woman is with once. But in a man, the main hormone released is dopamine, which can actually have the opposite effect, causing a man to want to leave the woman he was just with and find more new partners. Because of this hormonal mismatch, casual sex has a much different emotional impact on women versus men. The risk of emotional attachment is something that women bear the burden of. And that's on top of bearing the brunt of the physical risk. After all, it's women who risk getting pregnant, and therefore who are ultimately responsible for birth control. And it's women who are biologically more vulnerable to STDs. Peggy Orenstein is a researcher who has studied the attitudes of adolescent females with regard to sex. She reports that while young women may feel entitled to engage in sexual behavior, they don't necessarily feel entitled to enjoy it. In her research, she found that 30% of the time, young women describe their sexual experiences with words like painful, depressing, and degrading, while young men use those words 0% of the time. Relationship researcher Sarah McClelland has found that women rate their sexual satisfaction by how much pleasure their partner experienced in an encounter, whereas men measure their satisfaction by how much pleasure they themselves experience. This may explain the orgasm gap, the fact that in hetero couples, 95% of men regularly have orgasms compared to only 65% of women. That's even worse than the wage gap. And it may also explain why women are sometimes coerced into doing things they would rather not do. I'm talking about violent acts, like choking, hair pulling, punching, and spitting, that are normalized in mainstream pornography and beyond. Women are taught to never kink shame anyone, including their partners. And even though the specter of consent hangs in the air, many women do feel pressure to take part in these activities in order to seem open-minded and progressive. And this pressure is magnified when impressionable young women use social media like TikTok, where a recent trend was vanilla shaming. That is, ridiculing women who don't want to experiment with violent sex. TikTok is home to a large BDSM community, and it's a place where a graphic video of a young woman covered in severe bruises, smiling and bragging about the night she spent with her guy friend, gets over 5 million likes. But not all members of Gen Z, the TikTok generation, are buying into the narrative that promiscuity, pornography, and violent sex are liberating for women. Some are pushing back. They're waking up and realizing there's a big gap between the message they've been sold and reality. In December, Billie Eilish spoke out against the dangers of pornography and the tangible harm it does to women. And this month, an article in The Guardian declared that Generation Z is turning its back on sex-positive feminism. The article quoted a young woman named Anna Louise, who summed up her feelings as, "Sex positivity doesn't benefit women. Even if there are individuals who feel personally empowered, collectively it continues to oppress us. It's all well and good saying that we can have sex now without being shamed and victim blamed. But it's not like that's being translated into real life." And she's right. We promote sexualization and promiscuity in women without addressing that which keeps sex oppressive, the pervasive and constant fear of male violence, and a lack of quality sex education, something that would disproportionately benefit women. The pushback from women like Billie and Anna Louise feels actually liberating and empowering. It's brave of these women to question the training, the indoctrination, and brainwashing they've been subjected to in their lives. But they are like David going against Goliath, where Goliath is an entire culture that shames women for questioning the narrative. Women who see the myth of sexual liberation for what it is, a movement to benefit men, are labeled as sex negative, puritanical, prude, femcel, and conservative. This societal shaming is a larger scale version of the intimate coercive tactics used by men to try to get what they want out of a woman in the bedroom. Like individual men, society at large balks at women who put up barriers and boundaries and who stand up for themselves and question the status quo. These women are often met with hyperbolic questions like, "Oh, you're against porn? So does that mean you think all women should wear burqas?" But those who say things like that and who claim these women are Puritans are the ones who are limiting women to one of two roles: hypersexual or chaste, whore or Madonna. Those two archetypes might seem like opposites, but they are really the same thing. They both push the idea that women are objects, animate property existing only in relation to men's pleasure. But in fact, women are whole individuals, fully independent human beings with the potential to have rich lives of their own. Men, by the way, are never subjected to the false Madonna-whore dichotomy. Men's personhood and men's sexual freedom are both taken for granted. Only women are subjected to this closed-minded view. Hugh Hefner, a profiteering pornographer who emerged early in the sexual liberation movement, thought of himself as a feminist. He believed the delusion that his work furthered women's rights. But you can't exploit women and free them at the same time. If your brand of feminism aligns with men like Hugh Hefner, and if your brand of feminism benefits men more than women, and if your brand of feminism causes women to feel ashamed of their bodies, coerced into doing things they don't want to do, is it really feminism? The narrative that mainstream feminism pushes, the idea that sex and sexualization will lead to women's freedom, is nonsense. And it's been very bad for women. But it's an easy sell. Men love it. And positivity is always an easier sell. It's happy, optimistic, and sprinkled with glitter. Words like liberation and empowerment sound really good, but they are just words, empty lies. But at least some women are awake to the truth.